Shifting gears now to Medicare, it achieved a milestone Tuesday by announcing the list of 10 drugs that would be the first ever to face price negotiations. Now, some analysts were surprised by a few of the picks, but remain confident that all drugs represent no real threat to company earnings. For more on this story, we're joined by Anjalee Khemlani. Anjalee, I know you've been following this for us.
That's right, Rochelle. It's definitely interesting to see some of the picks yesterday. Of course, many analysts had already picked and targeted some of those drugs, but I got an interesting note from JPM looking at those picks saying that overall the update was largely expected with key drugs like Eliquis and Imbruvica on that list, but Stelara from Johnson & Johnson was a surprise for many because of the fact that it faces biosimilar competition in the upcoming years before the 2026 year that this goes into effect. However, the rest of the drugs are small revenue and earnings per share contributors to their company. So JPM doesn't really see that. And I saw that theme repeated in many of the notes that came out yesterday. But what I started thinking about also was how much of that is true when it comes to the earnings and the profit, or rather the sales from these companies in the time period that CMS looked at, which was June of last year through May of this year. I did a little bit of back of the napkin math to take a look at Eliquis first, for example. CMS did say that in that time period, the cost to it for Part D beneficiaries was $16.5 billion. And that total seems to match what Bristol-Myers Squibb and Pfizer, who both share in the profits for this, did mention in their quarterly earnings in that time period. And that's, if you compare that to their total revenues for that time period, Bristol-Myers Squibb saying that $57 billion is what their total revenues were for that year, and nearly $78 billion for Pfizer. And then I looked at Stelara, the surprise pick. That was on the lower end for Medicare, $2.6 billion as their cost. And then meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson saying in that same time period, again, last June to this May, $12.7 billion from Stelara alone. And if you compare that to the total company's earnings of $121.7 billion, you can see how it does contribute a smaller amount. In the previous example, we did often see Eliquis cited as a driver of earnings for those two companies. And Stelara has always been called out as a strong product. So it will be interesting whether or not those LOEs, that loss of exclusivity, is that driver behind those comments for the analysts on, considering how much of an impact it really is going to take on these companies' earnings moving forward. We did see some notes about analysts estimating that the price drop could be somewhere in the 40% range from the current pricing. So definitely something to keep an eye on as the negotiation process begins next year.
And Ange, what happens to all of the lawsuits against Medicare now?
Yeah, good question. So, most of these companies that we saw listed, like I said, expected. So the companies had already filed, citing their anticipation as being targeted by this list. Astellas, for example, did not make the cut. Whether or not they will continue to push forward in their lawsuit remains to be seen. Pfizer has not yet independently filed a lawsuit. However, it is, as we mentioned earlier, one of the companies that has a drug listed. Novartis as well is one of those, Novo Nordisk. So a couple of those companies haven't yet individually filed. They do belong to pharma, the lobbying firm, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which we know has filed those lawsuits. But as of right now, unclear on which ones will go forward, which new ones will be expected. And so we're keeping an eye on that for you.
All right, Anjalee Khemlani, thanks for tracking all of this and keeping an eye on it. We appreciate it.